In this video, you will see me carve a table as if it was coming from a single piece of wood. My inspiration for this build comes from Tactile Studio, a woodworking YouTube channel where you can find similar projects. I'll take you through the complete process and mention my learnings and any mistakes that I've made. Let's start. The wood I'm using for the construction is yellow pine. I was somewhat familiar with the type of wood and had an idea of what to expect. It wasn't ideal, and I'll share my experience as we go along. For the build, I need a total of 5 pieces. 2 larger circles for the top and the pedestal, 2 smaller circular pieces for making a continuous transition pattern of the top and the bottom into the central column and then a central column. My stock is 2 inches thick and about 10 inches wide, which means that I'll have to join the pieces to get the required width. At this point, for the most part, I am working on the surfaces that are to be jointed and not on the faces of these boards. This is because the surfaces were to be carved later and any imperfections will be taken care of. I'll just be using a hand planer to make these boards flat enough for gluing to each other. I'm using a simple jig on my router to cut the circles. The jig is pivoted to the center of this board using a screw. And to receive the screw, I had marked the center of the board using a small nail. And that is where the rough surfaces of the jointed boards caused an error. I had missed the center and the cut was not a complete circle. I fixed the mistake by reducing the size of the circle by 2/8 of an inch, and I was lucky that my design allowed that. I realized that I should have been more careful in marking this rather rough surface of the boards for accuracy. My router bit cannot cut through the complete depth of this board, so I'll have to use a jigsaw to complete the cut from the opposite face. For this, I marked the outer edge of the router cut using a marking jig and made my cut. For finishing, I removed the extra margin using a flush trim bit on my router. In making the cut with the jigsaw, I was too close to the edge and cut slightly into my circle. Rather than reducing the size to correct this mistake, I reclaimed the rib section and finished it after gluing. And then I think it went well. The next was cutting 2 smaller circular pieces that were slightly different in sizes for the top and the bottom. For making the surfaces smooth to prepare for assembling, I first used an angle grinder with a sandpaper. Though this was relatively quick, but left some degree of unevenness on the surface. Random orbital sander was my second choice, which I believe did a better job. I marked centers of all 4 circles for alignment and left a small nail there so that the pieces won't slip as epoxy is applied for bonding. The epoxy had to be warmed a little to make it easy to handle. I think my use of epoxy was a little lavish than what was actually required, but this being my first time I was using epoxy, I will accept it as a learning curve. I left the pieces clamped overnight for proper drying. For the table's central column, I used 2 pieces with about 20 inches length to make a 4x4 square. The structure is now ready for assembling. I used a single dowel each at the bottom and the top with epoxy. The dowel was just there to avoid relative slipping of the pieces after application of the epoxy and not as such for providing any strength. Here is how I applied pressure on the joints for curing. I laid the glued pieces on a perfectly flat surface and placed weights on top that were light enough not to squeeze epoxy out of the joints. I left it flat overnight. The table is now ready to be carved. I marked thickness of the top to a little less than 1 inch for finish. For carving, I use two types of 4-inch wood grinding disc. The first is a carbide cup wheel rasp type design and the second a chainsaw design. The chainsaw design is more aggressive and used for faster stock removal performance. At the same time, this tool is very grabby and there are chances of disc biting into the wood. This is not only a safety concern but will also give unintended cuts. The carbide cup wheel is relatively less aggressive and gives a neat cut that you would want as you are close to the finish. Since this was my first attempt at carving, I wanted to be more careful and started with a safer option. After getting some idea of how the discs were behaving, I switched to the chainsaw type design. This removed a ton of material very quickly but with obvious bite marks on the wood. Being too deep, these cuts shall have to be dealt with prior to sanding. I also experimented with the carbide disc on a bigger grinder. This provided more power and added accuracy, but at the same time it was more difficult and tiring to handle. This is an example of how the chainsaw disc will behave. I was too close to the required thickness of the top and the disc bit into the wood. But the disc is not the only thing to blame, and you would notice that the bite occurred at a section where the grain pattern of the wood is darker. The dark grain lines in the segments are oilier, harder and more difficult to work on with smaller tools. So as you transition from the soft to the hard section while working, the tool will behave differently and either slip over or bite under. And that is exactly what happened. I repaired this section with a piece of wood with somewhat matching grain. This next component of the design is the hollowing out the base of the table, and this is something I have taken from the design of Blacktail Studio. This is with an appreciation that, number one, to start with, a large surface area in contact with the ground should mean more stability. Number two, reducing weight at the bottom will raise the center of gravity of the piece that could reduce stability, though it is not significant here. I have made this part of my design because my view is that the rim could protect damages and deformation to the whole base over time, and that if the base were to warp or deform at some point, there will be less surface area available to take effect and compromise balance of the table. I keep the base of the table relatively thick compared to the top. This is because the base is smaller in size and we need to counterbalance the weights at the top and at the bottom. By now, the use of grinder was more familiar and I think I was getting better at it. In finishing the pedestal, I had to keep switching among using a spoke shave, a rasp cut file, random orbital sander, and hand sanding to even out the surface. It was the same uneven removal of material that I experienced due to oil in the wood grain. Again, the blade of the spoke shave was slipping on the dark grain and I had to go back with the file and then a sander to fix it. I now recall the warning regarding being careful when removing a ton of material from one side of the wood because one would be risking bending the wood. This did happen for me, but I am not sure how I could have avoided this since I had to carve only from the underside of the table. I think the reason for this are both uneven stresses due to tooling at one side only and the physical properties of the type of wood I am using. To fix it, I used these C-channels from a drawer slide. After cutting slots at the bottom using router, I simply fixed the channel using screws after pulling the top back into position with clamps. The result was not a perfectly flat top, but it was somewhat better than what it was before. I wanted a round edge profile both at the bottom and the top. This was straightforward for the top, but a bit maneuvered for the base due to an upward sloping angle of the base towards the column of the pedestal. Next, it was sanding up to 400 grit in a series of steps which took quite some time. My table is now ready for finish. I started with shellac without any dyes to keep the original look and a visible grain. At this point, to make the color a bit darker and bring more contrast, I decided to use an oil-based English chestnut wood stain. I did not like the look and had to strip it all. There was a lot of sanding with repeated soaking of wood with water to ease the process. It was ready for staining again, and I did not want to do it myself this time. I did not have the expertise or the materials available to get the finish I wanted, so I handed the piece to a professional who had worked for me earlier. This is how it looked in the end.